He heard them before he saw them. Two shapes, low, left. Saburo Sakai rolled his Zero and began his descent. August 7th, 1942, above Guadalcanal. The air was clear. Visibility was good. He had altitude. Everything was in his favor. By this moment, Sakai had destroyed 64 enemy aircraft. 64. He had been doing this since 1937. 5 years of war in the air, over China, over the Pacific, in every kind of weather, at every altitude. He had survived things that killed better men. He had come back from engagements that shouldn't have had survivors. He was 26 years old, and he was the finest living combat pilot in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He was looking at two Wildcats. On paper, this wasn't a fight. The Zero was faster, more maneuverable, climbed higher, flew further. In a turning contest, the Zero's radius was tighter by a margin so large it wasn't really a contest. In a climb, the Zero pulled away. In a straight run, the Zero pulled away. Sakai knew exactly what a Wildcat did when a Zero came for it. He had seen it before, many times. He pushed forward, picked his angle, began the run. One Wildcat turned, not away, toward him. Sakai adjusted. Standard response. Close the angle, don't let it develop into a head-on. The second Wildcat disappeared from his peripheral vision. He didn't know where it went. That was the first wrong thing. In 5 years of combat, Sakai always knew where both aircraft were. You tracked them the way a chess player tracks the board. You didn't need to look directly. You felt them. The second Wildcat was simply gone. And then, fire. Right rear quarter. From an angle that should have been empty. Glass. Blood. His right eye stopped working. In the seconds after the impact, Sakai's mind was still running the fight, still calculating, still trying to reconstruct where the fire had come from. He couldn't. The geometry didn't work. What Sakai didn't know, what none of them knew, was that those two Wildcats weren't just flying together. They were operating as a single mechanism. When one became the target, the other was already turning in from the flank. The moment the attacker committed, the moment he narrowed his focus to the kill, the second aircraft was closing from the angle his own attack had opened up. Not improvised, not instinct, designed. It had a name, the Thach Weave, and it was invented by one man. Not in a briefing room, not at a classified facility. At a kitchen table in Coronado, California, with matchsticks, while the best fighter pilots in the Japanese Empire kept dying and couldn't explain why. The Tainan Air Group was considered unbeatable. They had been killing Americans since the first day of the war. They knew the air, the angles, the timing, the margins, better than anyone alive. What was happening to them over Guadalcanal made no sense. The debrief reports kept coming back to Rabaul with the same sentence. I didn't know where the second one came from. The answer had been worked out a full year earlier, by a man who had never seen a Zero in combat. 35 hours. That was what the United States Navy required before a pilot could fly in combat. 35 hours. A Japanese carrier pilot arrived at his first combat assignment with 500. Some had 700. Sakai, by Guadalcanal, had over 1,000. One of the tests was a spinning chair. The applicant sat in it. An examiner spun it fast, stopped it suddenly, and watched their eyes. Most men's eyes kept moving after the chair stopped. A reflex, involuntary. A pilot's eyes had to stop with the chair. 7,000 applicants for a single intake. 70 passed. They trained for years before their first deployment. And when they deployed, they were sent to China, where the fighting had been going on since '37, where the air was already full of experienced opponents. They didn't train against simulation. They trained against reality. Over Nanking, over Chungking. They killed Soviet volunteers in Polikarpov fighters. They killed Chinese pilots in Curtiss Hawks. And they accumulated victories while Europe was still pretending the war hadn't started. Nishizawa Hiroyoshi. His own squadron called him the Devil. He flew with an aggression that made his wingmen nervous and his opponents dead. Ota Toshio. Methodical, precise, the kind of man who never made the same mistake twice. Sakai Saburo, who had shot down Soviet biplanes over China when he was still a teenager and had not stopped since. The same summer, Coronado, California. A Tuesday evening. John Thach was sitting at his kitchen table with an intelligence report and a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He had been a naval aviator for over a decade. He was the commanding officer of VF-3, one of the Navy's carrier fighter squadrons. He was soft-spoken, Arkansas-born, and not given to dramatics. He read the report a third time. Maximum speed, 331 miles per hour. Maneuverability, exceeds all current American carrier fighters. Rate of climb, 15% higher than the F-4F Wildcat. Armament, 2 20mm cannons, 2 machine guns. He set it down. He was not panicking. He was not catastrophizing. He was doing what he did with difficult problems, looking at what was actually true and starting from there. What was actually true? In a one-on-one fight, a Wildcat pilot against a competent Zero pilot was probably going to die. That was the starting point. While Thach sat at that table, Sakai was over China, adding to his count, 63,000 miles away, and moving toward each other at the speed of a war neither of them had started. They would never meet. They would never know each other's names until long after the war. But in the summer of 1941, one of them was building the trap, and the other was still certain he was the kind of man no trap could hold. He got out a box of matches, laid 2 down, American pair, laid 2 more, enemy. What do you do when you're slower, you can't climb away, and you can't outturn him? Standard answer, run. Didn't work. The Zero was faster. Go vertical. Trade speed for altitude. Bleed his energy. Didn't work. The Zero climbed better. Break into him. Force an overshoot. Reverse. Worked once, sometimes. Then he reset, came back with energy, and the same problem was waiting. Thach moved the matches. Dead end. Moved them again. Dead end. Every solution assumed the fight was between the 2 aircraft directly involved. 1 attacker, 1 defender. He stared at the table for a long time. And then something shifted. Not a calculation, not a diagram worked to its conclusion, but the kind of thing that happens when you've been staring at a problem long enough that the background becomes foreground. What if the fight wasn't between 2 aircraft? What if it was between 1 aircraft and 2? He leaned forward. 2 Wildcats. Wide formation. Far enough apart that an attacker had to pick one. The attacker picks one, commits, closes. At that exact moment, the targeted aircraft turns, not away, toward the other American. And the other American turns toward him. They are crossing. The attacker, following the first aircraft's turn, is now flying across the nose of the second. He has 2 choices. Follow through and fly in front of a gun that is already pointing at him. Or break off, give up the kill, reset, burn fuel, try again. There is no third option. Not if the timing is right. Not if both pilots move together, not on a radio call, but on the signal of each other's movement alone. The Wildcat's weakness, its slowness, its lesser agility, was irrelevant. What mattered was the attacker's commitment. And commitment was something you couldn't train away. It was physics. It was the geometry of the kill. He called it the beam defense. Everyone else would call it the weave. He took VF3 over San Diego Bay and started drilling. The first sessions were ugly. The timing was hard. The instinct when someone is shooting at you is to run, to break away, put distance between yourself and the threat. Turning toward your wingman, toward the center, felt wrong in the body, even when it made sense in the head. Thach kept drilling it. Every attack angle, every entry point, low altitude, high altitude, head on, beam, stern, until the hesitation disappeared, until it stopped being a decision and became something that lived below decision. Then December 7th happened. The ships burned. Nobody wanted to hear about new tactics. They wanted aircraft. They wanted pilots. They wanted the bleeding to stop. The Weave went on the shelf. Not canceled. Not forgotten. Waiting. 6 months later, the Yorktown was steaming toward Midway. Thach had 6 Wildcats. 6. He still didn't know if the Weave worked against a real Zero. In a real fight. With men who were actually trying to kill him. While Thach's 6 Wildcats were being spotted on the Yorktown's deck, on the other side of the same ocean, in Rabaul, Sakai was preparing for the same day. He didn't know Midway was happening. He didn't know a man named Thach existed. He knew the Americans had landed on Guadalcanal and that the Tainan group was going to fly there and destroy whatever they found. That was the extent of his concern. He had 64 kills. He had been doing this for 5 years. He had never lost. June 4th, 0755. Thach led his 6 Wildcats off the Yorktown's deck as escort for Torpedo Squadron 3, the Devastators. 115 miles per hour at wave-top height. They had to fly straight. They had to fly low. They could not maneuver, not with a torpedo slung under the belly. Their only protection was Thach's 6. What he didn't know yet was that the Japanese CAP had been fighting since dawn. The men coming down at him now had already killed Americans that morning. They had burned fuel and adrenaline and come back up looking for more. They were not fresh. They were sharp. They came from above, between 20 and 30. Thach had 6. He saw them as glints first, the sun-catching wing edges coming down fast. He counted. He thought about the table, the matches. Now we find out. The first pass lasted 3 seconds. The Zeros came through the formation fast, committed attacks, picking targets. 2 Wildcats went down. Not wounded, not forced to disengage. Down. Before Thach had fired a shot. Before anyone had responded effectively. 4 left. He keyed the radio. 1 word. Break. His wingman turned toward him. He turned toward his wingman. The Zero on his tail, which had committed, which was inside the firing solution, which had everything it needed to kill him, had to choose. Right now. This second. It broke. The Zero broke. Thach felt something he would spend years trying to describe accurately. Not relief, not triumph. Confirmation. The geometry worked. The second Wildcat was already there. And then it happened again. Another Zero committing on 1 Wildcat. The cross turn. The choice. Break or fly into the second gun. It broke. And again. And again. 20 minutes. 4 aircraft against 20 or more. The Weave held. They lost men. They lost aircraft. The Devastators were massacred. Every one of them shot down before they could release effectively. 41 men. The Weave could not fix what the numbers meant at that altitude and that speed against that opposition. That part of Midway is its own story, and it ends in the water. But Thach's 4 came back. He landed and went straight to debrief. He described every pass, every break, every time the weave created the crossing angle, and what the zero did when it got there. Precise, methodical. Because other men were going to fly this, and they needed to know exactly what it did. He wrote it up that night, sent it up the chain. Within weeks, the weave was being taught at every naval fighter training command in the Pacific. 2 months after Midway, the Americans landed on Guadalcanal. The Tainan group got the order to fly. 560 miles. Sakai strapped in. He was at 64 kills. He had no reason to believe this day would be any different from the last 1,000 days. He had every reason to believe it would be exactly the same. The shelling started at midnight. Every night, somewhere between midnight and 3, Japanese destroyers came down the slot and put shells into Henderson Field. Not randomly, on purpose. At the runway, at the fuel dump, at the tents where the pilots slept. The pilots of the Cactus Air Force learned to dig foxholes before they learned the local geography. They flew aircraft held together with parts stripped from wrecks. They ate when there was food. They had malaria. They flew when the planes could fly. Against the Tainan group, every day. The Japanese came in daylight, from Rabaul, 560 miles. The coast watchers on the jungle hilltops to the north would pick them up in Radio Henderson. 20 minutes. 20 minutes to get aircraft airborne, climb to altitude, and form up before the Zeros arrived. 20 minutes sounds like enough. It wasn't. The weave worked best with energy, speed, altitude, room to maneuver. Starting the fight from below, low and slow, with Zeros already in a diving attack. That was a different problem. That was most mornings. So they fought from below, in inferior aircraft, against men who'd been doing this for 5 years. And they used the one thing the Tainan group didn't have. They drilled it on the ground. Hand signals, eye contact, the turn, the timing, the angle of the cross. Because over Guadalcanal, there was often no radio. Or the radio was broken from the nightly shelling. Or the noise made it useless in the middle of a turning fight at 250 miles an hour. The weave had to work without words. And it did. Not every time. Not perfectly. Men died. Every week over that island, men died. But the Tainan pilots started coming home with something new in their debrief reports. Not confidence. Confusion. I had him. I was inside his turn. I was committed. And then... The sentence never finished cleanly. Because they didn't have a word for what had happened. The weave had no name in Japanese. No equivalent in their training. No counter. Because no one had ever built a counter to something that didn't exist until a man in Coronado sat down with a box of matches. In Rabaul, the losses were being tracked. August, September, October. The Tainan group had arrived as the finest fighter unit in the world. By October, Ota Toshio, dead. 19 victories. Killed over Guadalcanal. China campaign veterans, dead. Men with hundreds of hours of combat. Men who had been the foundation of Japanese air power since before most American pilots had their wings. Dead. Replacement pilots cycling in with a third of the hours, because the men who had the hours were gone. And the replacements flew the same missions, against the same weave, with less of everything. Sakai was not among the dead. He had been evacuated to Japan in August, the wound too serious for Rabaul, the skull fragment too close to things that couldn't afford to be damaged further. He spent months in hospital. He had time, more time than he wanted, to go back over August 7th, to reconstruct it from the beginning, to ask the question the debriefs kept failing to answer. Where did the second one come from? 560 miles. That is the distance Sakai flew after the bullet hit him. Let that number sit. 560 miles. Over open ocean. No landmarks. Navigation by a sun that was, at that moment, his enemy, because the light hit the damaged eye like a blade every time the aircraft banked. One eye dark, the other tunnel vision. Every degree of bank brought the sun across his field of view. His right hand had partial function, something the impact had done to the nerves. He couldn't be precise, couldn't fully control the grip. He was flying an aircraft that demanded constant adjustment, constant correction, with a hand that didn't entirely respond. Some instruments readable, some not. Alone over that ocean. He didn't turn back toward Guadalcanal. There was nothing there for him. He flew north for 5 hours. He described the horizon, not as a navigation point, as a consciousness point. As long as the horizon was where it should be, he was upright. As long as the horizon was where it should be, he was still flying. He described the moments when it began to drift, when the edge of consciousness softened and the horizon tilted, and he would catch it and pull it back, again and again, for 5 hours. And then the coast of New Britain. He wrote that when he saw it, he wasn't entirely sure it was real. He had been holding it in his mind as a destination for so long that when it appeared, he had to decide, seeing it or imagining it. It was real. He landed. The ground crew said afterward they couldn't understand how the aircraft was still flying. He was pulled from the cockpit, taken to the medical station, evacuated to Japan. He lost most of the useful vision in his right eye permanently. He recovered. Enough. He flew again later in the war, but the months in hospital gave him something the men who died over Guadalcanal never had. Time. When he finally wrote his memoir, published in Japan in 1957, translated into English by Martin Caden 2 years later, he gave real space to August 7th. Not just the wound, the mechanics of it. He described the approach, the attack run, the moment the first Wildcat turned toward him instead of away, the adjustment he made, the disappearance of the second aircraft from his awareness, then the fire from the angle that should have been empty. He wrote that he did not understand it, that in all his years of combat, hundreds of engagements, dozens of opponents, he had never encountered anything that worked quite like that. He wasn't the only one. The surviving pilots of the Tainan group, the men who made it through and lived long enough to talk, they all described variations of the same thing. The second plane. Always the second plane. Coming from somewhere it wasn't supposed to be, at exactly the moment you were most committed. What the Tainan group never adapted to was the group logic of the Weave. Their entire combat philosophy, forged in years of individual contest over China, was built around the ace, the score, the personal duel. A system that made neither pilot the point, that made the pair the weapon, that turned commitment into vulnerability, wasn't just tactically foreign. It ran against how they understood what a fighter pilot was. And by the time the Tainan group was pulled from Guadalcanal in November, that misunderstanding had cost Japan something it could not rebuild. 3,500. That was how many experienced combat pilots Japan had when the war began. Not just skilled, irreplaceable. 7,000 applicants, 70 pass. Years of conditioning before a first deployment. That pipeline was designed for a war that won quickly. When they died, there was no one ready behind them. Guadalcanal was doing one specific thing every day, consuming irreplaceable experience at a rate no selection process could match. America was not training pilots the same way. America was building a machine. 35 hours to wings, then instrument training, formation flying, gunnery schools, carrier qualification. A pipeline producing thousands of pilots a year. Not individually as skilled as Sakai, not individually as skilled as Nishizawa, but trained in systems, trained to fly in pairs, trained in the Weave. And there were thousands of them. By the time the F-6F Hellcat arrived in the fall of '43, American pilots were not just flying a faster, tougher aircraft. They were flying it in a doctrine tested at Midway and refined over 7 months of daily combat above Guadalcanal. The pair. The mutual cover. The weapon that neither pilot is alone. The Tainan group was gone, most of them dead, but not Nishizawa. Mishizawa Hiroyoshi, the devil, had survived the entire Guadalcanal campaign. 36 confirmed kills. He was the highest-scoring living Japanese ace. And Japanese command had recognized by then what they were losing. Not aircraft, not fuel, but something you couldn't manufacture. The specific knowledge that lived inside men who had been fighting since 37 and hadn't died yet. So they pulled Nishizawa from combat, sent him to train the replacements. The finest individual fighter pilot in the Japanese Navy, grounded. Kept alive as an instructor because they couldn't afford to let the last of the original men go into the sky and not come back. October 26, 1944. Nishizawa was a passenger. He was aboard a transport aircraft, a Nakajima C-6N, being ferried between bases in the Philippines. Not in a Zero, not in a cockpit. Cargo. A flight of American Hellcats intercepted the transport. The Hellcat pilots were flying pair tactics. They had the altitude, they had the speed. The transport had no defense. Nishizawa Hiroyoshi, the devil, the man with 36 kills, the last great survivor of the original Tainan group, died as a passenger. Not in combat, not in a Zero. Shot down by the system he had never understood. Flown by men trained in the Weave. 2 months before that, in June of '44, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The American pilots called it the Marianas Turkey Shoot. In 2 days, Japan lost over 400 aircraft. The men flying for Japan that day were not the Tainan group. They were the men who replaced the men who replaced the men the Tainan group used to be. Trained in months, not years. Deployed before they were ready. Flying against pilots who had grown up on the Weave. After the war, American intelligence officers sat down with the survivors. They interviewed Japanese pilots, commanders, engineers, anyone who could explain how the advantage had shifted so completely and so fast. The transcripts still exist, and they contain something that sounds almost exactly like the debrief reports from Rabaul in '42. The same bewilderment, the same sentence in different words. I didn't know where the second one came from. An American officer walked into a room in Tokyo in 1945 and sat down across from a man who had once been his enemy. He put a folder on the table between them. He opened it. He asked one question. What changed? When? This happened hundreds of times across Japan and the occupied territories in the months after the surrender. American intelligence officers with translators, sitting across tables from Japanese pilots, commanders, aircraft designers. Not in triumph. In the analytical sense. What had changed? When? Why? They asked about aircraft, about fuel, about training. And then they asked about tactics. About where the advantage had shifted, and when. The answers were not primarily about aircraft. They were about pairs. Multiple surviving pilots described the same transition point. Late '42, Guadalcanal. Consistent. Even when interviewed separately. Even when they had no reason to align their accounts. Before that, American pilots flew, some were skilled, and you could beat the skilled ones if you were better. The contest was individual. The better man won. After that, something had changed in how they moved together. You couldn't beat one without finding yourself in front of the other. The Japanese word for what they were describing, when they could find one, was closer to net than to tactic. Not something you fought against, something you were caught in. The more committed you were to the kill, the more you exposed yourself to the partner. Commitment, the defining quality of every ace, the thing that separated the killers from the hesitant, had been turned into a liability. Admiral Ugaki noted it in his wartime diary. Late '42. Something about the American fighter pairs producing unexpected losses among experienced pilots. Not explicable by aircraft performance alone. Something in how they were using their formation. He wrote it down. He moved on. Which was perhaps the most costly thing of all. Not the dying, the not understanding why. Sakai, in his memoir, was more direct. He wrote that the Americans had found a way to make the Wildcat's weakness into a weapon. That the slower aircraft, precisely because it was slower, could commit fully to the crossing turn in a way that a Zero, which needed speed to stay dangerous, couldn't simply outrun or outmaneuver. The thing that made the Wildcat inferior had been turned into the thing that made the Weave work. Thach became an admiral. He spent the rest of his career asking the same question he'd asked at that kitchen table. How do you build a system that wins when the individual pieces are outmatched? His answer had worked, not because of the Wildcat, not because of the pilots, because of the logic of the pair. Decades after the war, Sakai gave an interview. An American asked him about the Thach Weave by name. What did he think of it? Sakai paused, and then he said something that Thach, sitting at that table in 41, alone with the matches and the cold coffee, probably never imagined hearing from the man on the other side. Sakai said, "It was elegant." Not bitterness, not deflection. Genuine recognition. A man who had spent his life mastering the individual contest, acknowledging that something designed to defeat that contest entirely had been perfectly built. The Weave is still being taught, not because of the aircraft, not because of the pilots, because the geometry didn't change. An attacker who commits fully to one target is always exposed to the second. That was true when Thach worked it out with matchsticks. It was true when Nishizawa's transport went down. It's true now. Sakai heard them before he saw them. Two shapes, low, left. He had 64 kills. He was the finest living combat pilot in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had been in the air since 37, and he had never lost. He pushed forward, because the contest was between two aircraft, and his aircraft was better, and that had always been enough. Until the morning it wasn't, above Guadalcanal. When the second Wildcat appeared from exactly the angle it wasn't supposed to be. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel to avoid posting new videos. Like if you enjoyed it, and share your comments.